let's move through to the next question, which, following on from that, do I need to comply with the Health and Wellbeing Act 2008 and the pandemic orders that have been enacted by the Premier and the Minister? Do I need to comply with that in Victoria?
Okay, now I have a pretty comprehensive reply to this. It is about being a reasonable excuse. It's mentioned 11 times in the the Health and Wellbeing Act, and it's mentioned 4 times in the pandemic amendment. It's all about having a reasonable excuse for not complying with it. It says like 165BB, warning before giving a direction. Before exercising a pandemic management power to give a direction, the person exercising the power must, unless it is not practicable to do so, warn the person to whom the direction is given. The refusal or failure to comply with the direction without a reasonable excuse is an offence. So there's that power of being reasonable again. So if you can reason with them why what they're doing is not lawful or not sensible, it is not backed up by reality, and they are obliged to listen. And there's also another power underneath the same act, which says, this is section 112, least restrictive measure to be chosen. If in giving effect to this division, alternative measures are available which are equally effective in minimising the risk that a person poses to public health, the measure which is the least restrictive of the rights of the person should be chosen. So if you can engage the people that are trying to enforce this on you and explain to them you are taking measures that are equally as effective or better, then your direction, their direction, loses its effect on you. You have a reasonable excuse under that section, and you can use other mitigating forms. There's lots of scientifically proven ways to address the risks that they're trying to do by force.
So let me just interrupt you there for a moment, because I find this, because last week when I was looking at these pandemic bills, and I'm a marketer, and yes, I've read a lot, but I do get overwhelmed, and I certainly don't understand legalese like you do, and I don't have the capacity to read extended periods, pieces of legislation like you do, and like my other volunteer does, who has, worked through all this legislation for over 20 hours to make sure that it's all there for us to use. I was very down and depressed about it last week, thinking, oh my goodness, Victoria is royally screwed right now. What are we going to do? And I'm sure a lot of business owners are also feeling the same way. But after speaking with them, in the volunteer today, and you and that other volunteer have not actually talked at all, and yet you're reading the same pieces of legislation, you're coming out with the same information from that legislation. So what you've just said, if you're taking reasonable measures and the least extreme stuff that you can do, and we've already agreed that getting jabbed does not affect transmissibility, that jabbed people can transmit, unjabbed people can transmit, jabbed people will end up sick, unjabbed people will end up sick. Could we then actually say that a reasonable measure for a business owner would be, regardless as to whether it's my right under this permanent pandemic bill, to actually legally find out your vaccine status? I then could choose not to discriminate, because that's also my right and it's the law, and federal overrides state. But by using a reasonable response and putting in my own COVID safe plan, could I instead opt to, in fact, welcome all pending I just take their temperature and say, well, you're not running a temperature, I'd say you're probably fine. And whether you're jabbed or unjabbed, you could still transmit. I'm doing the best I can to ensure the safety of myself, my staff, and my patrons. Come one, come all. What do you say to that? Could we just start taking people's temperature?
That would be more than a reasonable measure. It's people who, and if you're discriminating between vaccinated and unvaccinated based on the fact if they're going to be infectious in a place and spreading this disease around, that I've read at least 3 studies showing that the the viral load build in your upper respiratory tract around your nose and your throat is the same in unvaccinated and vaccinated. And that is what makes you infectious. When you breathe, those virons come out and spread around. And those tiny, tiny little virons, and they're airborne and they just go everywhere. One thing possible though is vaccinated people, it suppresses the symptoms. So you could quite possibly have people who don't have the symptoms but still have the viral load. That's where I think that there is because they market it on it makes you suffer less, but in like your I had a discussion with my doctor. I went in there and he didn't like the fact that he knows I'm an asthmatic, but he would still expected me to wear a mask. And I said, I can't. I tried to do this to please people. And then he's saying to me, how do you know you're not infectious? And I said, well, I haven't had the vaccine, so it's not suppressing any of my symptoms. So if I had the virus, I would be sick. And he just shook his head and didn't say, and he tried to admonish me for being irresponsible. I explained to him his mask that had a filter on it, breathing, a free flowing filter that was breathing out, did not protect me because it just breathed straight out. And then I explained to him that on most surgical masks, the average thread gap size is 100 micrometers. That's the space between the thread going both ways. And COVID viron is 0.125 micrometers. That's an 800 times size difference. And it's explaining that to people. You say, imagine a COVID viron the size of a soccer ball, and that which is 20 centimeters in diameter. Multiply that by 800 and you have a 160-meter goalpost, high and wide. How is that going to stop a soccer ball? How is that going to stop a swarm of soccer balls? That does not work. The only thing it's going to do is if people are spitting or coughing, which I tell people before all this happened was an offensive, nasty habit anyway. You cough into your you cough into your armpit or lift your shirt or cough away from people. It's unnecessary. There's lots of studies showing that it's actually causing issues with people's health, especially if they don't. There was a Sydney Morning Herald article 9 years ago. If you look it up, it was a fast mask. And they talk about it only lasts for 20 minutes, the masks, before they become useless, if they do anything. And it was warning companies, the federal government was warning companies not to try and price gouge people and take advantage of this and market things for the purposes that they weren't supposed to be being used for, which is this was back when SARS was around, the original one.
I read that article. I actually did read that article. I know what you're talking about. And that was on mainstream media. Exactly.
And they've just turned it all upside down. And the science is 50 years of science showing the flu, it's got no benefit for airborne viruses. Even if the material wasn't so transparent, it would come in through the sides and the top. They're not fitted properly. It's more of a psychological effect than anything.
Yes, exactly.